On Mother's Day, my daughter gave her mother-in-law a $20,000 ring and a cruise to Alaska and handed her own mother a $5 plastic bracelet. The waiter would later repeat to his wife, still shaking his head at what he had witnessed. Margaret Whitmore sat perfectly still at the long, white-clothed table in the private dining room of the Hartford Country Club, her back straight, her hands folded lightly in her lap, as if she were attending a formal luncheon rather than her own Mother's Day celebration. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching the crystal glasses and scattering soft prisms of light across the table. A trio played gentle jazz near the bar. The room smelled faintly of lilies and fresh bread. Across from her, Emily Carter beamed as she opened a small velvet box and lifted out a diamond ring that caught every ounce of that afternoon light. "For you, Diane," Emily said warmly, her voice bright enough to carry to the neighboring tables. "For always welcoming me like your own." Diane Carter pressed a manicured hand to her chest, her eyes shining as her husband applauded, and a few guests nearby turned to admire the stone. It was large, tasteful, unmistakably expensive. Emily continued, almost breathless with pride, explaining that she and her husband had also booked Diane a 7-day Alaskan cruise departing from Seattle, balcony suite, all-inclusive. There were delighted gasps, the clinking of champagne flutes, the soft murmur of admiration. Margaret joined the applause. She even smiled. When the attention settled again, Emily turned toward her mother with a smaller gift bag, the tissue paper bright pink against the white tablecloth. "And this is just something fun for you, Mom," she said lightly. Margaret reached inside and pulled out a thin plastic bracelet, pale blue, the kind sold in bulk bins near a checkout counter. It was stamped with the words "Best Mom Ever" in uneven silver lettering. It weighed almost nothing in her palm. For a brief moment, the only sound Margaret heard was the distant hum of the air conditioner and the faint scrape of cutlery from another table. Then someone chuckled softly, assuming it was all playful. Margaret slipped the bracelet over her wrist. It clicked shut with a small, hollow snap. "It's lovely," she said calmly. Her voice did not tremble. She lifted her water glass carefully so the bracelet wouldn't knock against it. From across the table, Diane reached to admire her new ring again, tilting it toward the light. Cameras flashed. Emily leaned in to adjust the angle for a better photo. Margaret watched her daughter's face as she did it, focused, eager, proud. Not cruel, not angry, just certain about who needed to be impressed. The waiter refilled Margaret's glass and gave her a fleeting glance, as if searching for some sign of discomfort, but found none. She asked for no explanation. She made no comparison. She did not mention the years she had worked double shifts at the hospital after her husband passed, the tuition checks she had written so Emily could attend Northwestern, the down payment she had quietly transferred when Emily and her husband bought their first home in Westport. Those things hovered unspoken between the tulips and the linen napkins. Margaret simply folded her hands again and listened as the conversation moved on to cruise itineraries and glacier tours. But something inside her shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to settle into place. The bracelet rested against her skin, light as air, and for the first time, Margaret understood exactly where she stood. The applause faded into the soft clatter of plates and polite conversation, and Margaret Whitmore sat through the remainder of the brunch as if she were observing someone else's life from a respectful distance. Emily described the cruise itinerary in detail, mentioning glacier tours, whale watching, and a private balcony overlooking the inside passage, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. Diane leaned forward, laughing lightly, already discussing which formal dress she might pack for the captain's dinner. Margaret listened and nodded at the appropriate moments. She asked Diane whether she preferred early or late dining on ships. She complimented the cut of the ring. She even inquired about the weather in Alaska in early summer. Her voice remained steady, measured, calm. The plastic bracelet rested against her wrist, faintly cool against her skin. When she reached for her salad fork, it brushed the edge of her plate with a soft click, a small sound that seemed louder to her than the jazz drifting from the corner of the room. Across the table, Emily's husband began calculating the estimated value of the cruise package aloud, half joking, proud of the generosity. Someone teased that Diane had clearly won the daughter-in-law lottery. Laughter followed. Margaret smiled again, careful not to let it linger too long. She noticed details she might once have overlooked. The way Emily leaned toward Diane when speaking, the instinctive touch on her arm, the shared glances that felt like private affirmations. None of it was openly cruel. It was simply alignment. When dessert arrived, a delicate lemon tart with powdered sugar, Emily stood and raised her glass. She spoke about gratitude, about strong women who shaped her into who she was. She thanked Diane for guidance, for elegance, for teaching her how to host with grace. Margaret listened to her daughter's speech as if it were a story about a distant acquaintance. Her own name was mentioned briefly, gently, almost as an afterthought. And of course my mother, who has always been there, Emily added quickly, smiling in her direction before turning back to Diane to recount a recent shopping trip they had taken together. Margaret lifted her champagne flute and took a small sip. The bubbles stung her tongue, then disappeared. She remembered other Mother's Days, simpler ones, when Emily was small and handmade cards were slid across the kitchen table, construction paper still damp with glue. She remembered driving carpool in a minivan that rattled at every stoplight, remembering science fair dates and orthodontist appointments, remembering the night she stayed up sewing a costume for a school play because Emily had forgotten to mention it until the last minute. She did not measure those memories against the diamond ring across from her. She simply held them quietly, like photographs stored in a drawer no one else opened anymore. When the check arrived, Emily insisted on paying. Margaret did not argue. She rose from the table with practiced composure, smoothing her navy blazer, thanking everyone for a lovely afternoon. Outside, in the parking lot, the late spring air felt cooler than she expected. As Emily embraced Diane warmly and promised to finalize the cruise documents that week, Margaret stood beside her own car, keys in hand, watching her daughter glow with satisfaction. The bracelet caught the sunlight briefly, its silver letters flashing for a fraction of a second before dulling again. Margaret slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. She did not cry. She did not rehearse speeches in her head. She simply adjusted the rearview mirror, looked at her reflection, and acknowledged what the afternoon had revealed without anyone ever saying it aloud. Margaret drove home in silence, the quiet inside her sedan heavier than the soft jazz that had filled the restaurant earlier that afternoon. The highway stretched ahead in a long gray ribbon, lined with budding maple trees just beginning to show late spring green. She kept both hands on the steering wheel, her posture as upright as it had been at the table. At a red light, she glanced down at the bracelet again. The silver letters had already begun to fade slightly where they curved around her wrist. Best mom ever. The phrase felt less like praise and more like decoration. Something printed quickly and sold cheaply in bulk. She did not remove it. Not yet. When she pulled into the driveway of her colonial-style home in West Hartford, the house looked exactly as it always had. White shutters, trimmed hedges, the American flag moving gently near the porch. Nothing about it suggested that anything had shifted. Inside, the air held the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser she kept near the entryway. She set her purse on the console table and paused in the foyer, listening to the stillness. There had been a time when this house echoed with Emily's footsteps, with piano practice drifting from the living room, with arguments over curfews and college applications. Margaret walked slowly into the kitchen and placed her car keys in their usual bowl. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, illuminating the stack of mail she had not yet opened. Among the envelopes was a thank you card from a local charity and a notice from the bank regarding quarterly statements. Ordinary things. Reliable things. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned lightly against the counter. Her thoughts did not rush. They arranged themselves carefully, like files placed into labeled folders. She remembered Thanksgiving 2 years earlier when Emily had decided to host dinner at Diane's home instead, explaining that it would be easier for everyone. Margaret had driven 40 minutes with a pumpkin pie balanced carefully on the passenger seat, only to find that Diane had already ordered dessert from a bakery. She remembered Christmas morning when gifts were exchanged at Diane's house first, with Margaret invited to stop by in the afternoon. Once the children were tired. At the time, she had told herself that families evolve, that marriage shifts priorities, that it was natural. Standing in her kitchen now, she recognized the pattern more clearly. It had not been sudden. It had been gradual, polite, almost invisible. She walked upstairs to her bedroom and sat at the edge of the neatly made bed. On the dresser rested a framed photograph of Emily at her college graduation, cap slightly crooked, eyes bright with possibility. Margaret had stood in the crowd that day, clapping until her palms stung, proud beyond measure. She had never kept score. She had never expected repayment. But she had expected recognition. Not applause, just acknowledgment. The bracelet pressed lightly against her pulse as she reached to straighten the picture frame. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a question she had avoided for years. If her presence had become symbolic rather than essential, what would happen if she quietly changed the terms of her role? The house remained silent. Outside, a neighbor's lawn mower started up in the distance. Margaret exhaled slowly, not in anger, not in grief, but in clarity. Something had been revealed at that restaurant table, and now, alone in her own home, she began to understand what it required of her next. Margaret did not sleep much that night, but she did not toss and turn either. She lay on her back beneath the pale blue quilt she had bought the year after her husband passed, staring at the faint outline of tree branches shifting against the ceiling as headlights from passing cars moved across the walls. Her mind was not crowded with dramatic thoughts. It was precise, ordered. She began reviewing her life the way she once reviewed hospital charts during her years as a nurse, calmly assessing patterns, noting trends, identifying long-term changes. She thought about the financial help she had given Emily over the past decade. There had been the $30,000 transferred quietly to assist with the down payment on the Westport house, labeled as a gift so that no repayment would burden her daughter's pride. There had been smaller checks written for unexpected home repairs, preschool tuition, and once even a business loan when Emily briefly considered launching an online boutique. Margaret had never asked how the money was spent after it left her account. She trusted. That was her nature. She also thought about time, which felt more valuable than any check she had written. She had driven 2 hours round trip every Wednesday for nearly a year to help with childcare when Emily returned to work after her second child was born. She had canceled her own travel plans more than once to accommodate family schedules. None of those memories felt bitter. They felt factual, data points in a larger picture. Around 2 in the morning, Margaret rose from bed and walked quietly downstairs. The hardwood floors were cool beneath her feet. In her study, she turned on the small brass desk lamp that cast a warm circle of light over her paperwork. She opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and removed a thick folder labeled estate planning. The documents inside were neatly organized, updated 3 years earlier, but untouched since. She sat down, adjusted her reading glasses, and began flipping through the pages slowly. Her home, her investment accounts, the remaining life insurance policy, the modest trust established for her grandchildren. Everything was clearly outlined. Everything assumed continuity. She noticed that Emily was listed as primary beneficiary for nearly all remaining personal assets, with provisions that had once felt obvious and unquestioned. Margaret rested her hand lightly on the stack of papers. It was not anger that moved through her. It was awareness. If relationships could shift quietly over years, then financial structures could as well. She was 72 years old. She was in good health. She still volunteered twice a week at the local community clinic. She still managed her own portfolio. She was not fragile. The bracelet remained on her wrist, its plastic edge catching the lamplight. She rotated it once with her fingers and then slid it off carefully, placing it on the desk beside the estate folder. Without ceremony, she opened her laptop and searched for the contact information of her attorney, Richard Holloway, a man she had known for more than 15 years. His office was 10 minutes away, near the courthouse downtown. Margaret drafted a brief email requesting an appointment to review her estate plan and discuss adjustments. She did not mention the brunch. She did not mention the ring or the cruise. She simply wrote that circumstances had evolved and she wished to ensure her plans reflected her current intentions. When she pressed send, she felt neither vindictive nor triumphant. She felt steady, the kind of steadiness that comes from recognizing a truth and deciding to act before anyone else notices the shift. Upstairs, the house remained silent, unaware that something fundamental had just been set in motion. Richard Holloway replied the next morning at 9:15, his message brief and professional, offering Margaret an appointment that Friday at 10 o'clock. She confirmed within minutes. The rest of the week unfolded outwardly unchanged. On Tuesday, She volunteered at the community clinic, organizing patient files and guiding a young intern through intake procedures. On Wednesday, she attended her book club meeting, listening thoughtfully as the group discussed a novel about loyalty and inheritance. She did not mention her own quiet review of those themes. Each evening, she returned to her orderly home and continued reading through her financial documents, not obsessively, but with deliberate care. By Friday morning, she dressed in a tailored gray suit she reserved for formal appointments and drove downtown beneath a sky that threatened light rain. Richard's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building near the courthouse, the kind of place that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. He greeted her warmly, surprised perhaps by the urgency of her request, but too seasoned to show it. They sat across from one another at a long conference table, her folder open between them. Margaret spoke calmly, explaining that she wished to reassess her estate plan to ensure it reflected her current priorities. Richard listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking precise questions about her intentions. Did she wish to adjust beneficiary percentages? Did she intend to establish a charitable trust? Was there any concern about family disputes? Margaret answered each question clearly. She explained that she wanted to create a substantial scholarship fund in her late husband's name for nursing students at the local university, a cause that had always mattered deeply to her. She also wished to revise the distribution of certain liquid assets, reducing direct inheritance allocations and placing more funds into controlled trusts with specific conditions. Richard did not inquire about emotional motivations. He simply outlined the legal mechanisms required to implement her decisions. As they discussed numbers, Margaret felt an unexpected steadiness settle over her shoulders. These were not acts of retaliation. They were recalibrations. She was aligning her resources with the respect she believed should accompany them. When the meeting concluded, Richard promised draft revisions within a week. Margaret stood, shook his hand, and stepped back onto the sidewalk just as a light rain began to fall. She opened her umbrella and walked toward her car at an unhurried pace. That afternoon, Emily called casually to ask about Sunday dinner plans. Margaret listened to her daughter's cheerful voice describing a new patio set Diane had purchased for the summer. She responded politely, even warmly, but she did not volunteer updates about her appointment. The conversation remained surface level, comfortable, almost rehearsed. After they hung up, Margaret placed her phone face down on the kitchen counter and looked out through the window at her own backyard. The lawn was neatly trimmed. The hydrangeas were beginning to bloom. She understood that nothing outward had changed yet. No one had been confronted. No accusations had been spoken. But beneath the quiet rhythm of her days, a structural shift was underway, one that would not require raised voices to be felt. By the following week, the revisions to Margaret's estate plan were ready for her review. Printed neatly on thick cream paper and clipped into a leather folder Richard had sent by courier. She placed the folder on her dining room table and allowed it to sit there for several hours before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. She wanted to approach it with the same clarity she had felt in the attorney's office. Late that afternoon, with a cup of chamomile tea beside her, she began reading each page slowly. The scholarship fund in her husband Thomas Whitmore's name was outlined in careful legal language, detailing annual distributions to nursing students who demonstrated both academic merit and financial need. The amount allocated was substantial, enough to make a meaningful difference for generations. Margaret traced Thomas's name lightly with her fingertip and allowed herself a small, private smile. This felt right. The adjustments to Emily's inheritance were structured but unmistakable. A significant portion of the direct liquid assets had been redirected into a managed trust with conditions tied to long-term financial responsibility rather than immediate access. It was not punitive. It was protective. The grandchildren remained beneficiaries of education funds, but oversight would remain under Margaret's appointed trustee until they reached a mature age. Every line reflected intention, rather than emotion. As she turned the final page, she felt a sense of alignment settle within her. That evening, Emily stopped by unexpectedly, mentioning she was in the neighborhood after visiting Diane. She carried a container of leftover lemon bars and greeted her mother with casual affection. Margaret welcomed her in, set out 2 plates, and poured fresh coffee. They sat at the same dining table where the leather folder now rested, closed and composed. Emily chatted about patio renovations and summer travel plans, mentioning that Diane was considering upgrading her cruise excursion package to include a private glacier tour. Margaret listened, her expression warm but measured. At one point, Emily's eyes drifted toward the folder. "Working on something important?" she asked lightly. Margaret met her daughter's gaze and answered evenly that she had been reviewing long overdue paperwork, making sure everything was organized. Emily nodded, uninterested in further details, and returned to describing color palettes for outdoor cushions. Margaret noticed the ease with which her daughter assumed stability, assumed availability, assumed permanence. It was not malice. It was habit. When Emily left, hugging her mother quickly at the door, Margaret locked it behind her and stood in the quiet hallway for a moment. She understood now that power rarely announces itself loudly. It shifts quietly, often unnoticed until the balance has already changed. The next morning, she drove back to Richard's office and signed the finalized documents with a steady hand. Each signature marked not a rupture, but a recalibration. As she handed the pen back, she felt something close to relief. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded recognition. Instead, she had redrawn the lines of her own value in ink that would endure far longer than applause at a brunch table. Summer settled gently over West Hartford, bringing longer evenings and the soft hum of sprinklers across neatly trimmed lawns. Margaret adjusted to her revised reality with the same discipline she had shown throughout her life. Nothing about her outward routine suggested upheaval. She still attended her volunteer shifts at the clinic, still hosted her monthly book club, still sent birthday cards to neighbors written in careful blue ink. But internally, the axis had shifted. The scholarship fund paperwork was finalized, the trust structures legally secured, and copies of every document rested in a fireproof box inside her study. She no longer felt the subtle pressure to prove her generosity through spontaneous financial support. That shift revealed itself sooner than she expected. One evening in late June, Emily called with a measured tone that Margaret recognized immediately. There was talk of an unexpected opportunity, a short-term investment connected to her husband's expanding business. It required liquidity, quickly. Emily explained that traditional financing would take time, and she wondered whether her mother might be willing to help bridge the gap, just temporarily. Margaret listened without interruption, seated at her kitchen table where the late sunlight cast long golden lines across the wood grain. She asked thoughtful questions about the numbers, the projected returns, the risks. Emily's answers were optimistic but vague. In the past, Margaret would have responded before the call ended, reassuring her daughter that she would transfer funds by morning. This time, she did not rush. She told Emily she would think carefully and review her own financial commitments before making any decisions. There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable. Emily laughed lightly and said she understood, though her voice carried a hint of surprise. After the call ended, Margaret remained seated for several minutes, reflecting not on the request itself but on the assumption beneath it. Availability had once been automatic. Now it required consideration. The following afternoon, Emily stopped by in person, bringing along brochures and printed projections. Margaret welcomed her in with the same composed warmth as always. They reviewed the documents together at the dining room table. Margaret pointed out areas where the risk exposure seemed high and asked whether alternative financing options had been explored. Emily's posture stiffened slightly, her responses growing more defensive. She reminded her mother that family supported family. Margaret met her gaze steadily and agreed that support was important, but she added that responsible stewardship was equally important. She explained that her financial plans were structured differently now, with long-term commitments that limited immediate flexibility. She did not elaborate. She did not mention trusts or revised beneficiaries. She simply stated that she would not be providing the requested funds. Silence settled between them, heavier than any raised voice. Emily eventually gathered her papers, disappointment evident though restrained. She kissed her mother's cheek before leaving, but the gesture felt more habitual than affectionate. When the door closed, Margaret stood by the window and watched her daughter drive away. She did not feel victorious. She felt defined. Boundaries, she realized, were most powerful when delivered without anger. In the quiet that followed, Margaret returned to her study and opened the drawer where the faded plastic bracelet still lay. She held it for a moment, then set it back down, understanding now that its significance had changed. It no longer represented humiliation. It marked the exact moment she chose to redefine her worth on her own terms. By early August, the distance between Margaret and Emily was subtle but unmistakable, like a draft in a house that had once felt perfectly sealed. They still spoke weekly. They still exchanged polite updates about the grandchildren's summer activities and neighborhood news. Yet something beneath the surface had shifted, and both women sensed it even if neither named it aloud. One Sunday afternoon, Margaret received an invitation to a small gathering at Diane's home to celebrate the booking confirmation of the upgraded cruise package. The message was cheerful, almost casual, as if the previous tension over finances had evaporated. Margaret considered declining. Instead, she chose to attend. She dressed with quiet precision, selecting a simple navy dress and pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. When she arrived at Diane's house in Westport, the backyard was already arranged for guests, white patio umbrellas casting patterned shade over neatly arranged chairs. Diane greeted her warmly, her diamond ring catching the sun, as always. Emily moved between guests, hosting with practiced ease, her laughter bright and effortless. Margaret observed it all without resentment. She noticed how comfortably her daughter fit into this setting, how naturally she aligned herself with Diane's social circle. At one point, while arranging drinks near the outdoor bar, Margaret overheard a conversation that stilled her more than any raised voice could have. Emily was explaining to a neighbor that Diane had been instrumental in helping her navigate social expectations, teaching her which events mattered and how appearances shaped opportunities. There was admiration in her tone, almost reverence. Margaret did not interrupt. She simply absorbed the words, allowing them to settle. Later, as guests mingled near the garden, Emily approached her mother with a softened expression. She mentioned that she had been disappointed about the financial decision, but hoped there were no hard feelings. Margaret met her gaze steadily. She told her daughter that there were no hard feelings, only adjustments. She explained that as people grow older, they sometimes reassess how their support is structured, not to withdraw love, but to ensure it remains healthy. Emily seemed unsettled by the calmness of the response. She searched for signs of accusation and found none. Instead, she found clarity. The conversation ended without drama, yet it lingered. When Margaret left the gathering that evening, she walked slowly to her car, listening to the distant hum of cicadas. She realized that respect could not be requested. It could only be reflected. And reflection often began when assumptions were quietly removed. Back at home, she opened her study drawer once more and looked at the plastic bracelet resting beside the estate folder. For a brief moment, she considered throwing it away. Instead, she closed the drawer gently. It remained there not as a reminder of embarrassment, but as a marker of transformation. The shift had never required confrontation. It required consistency, and Margaret intended to remain consistent, even if it meant allowing others to slowly recognize the new boundaries she had drawn without ever raising her voice. Autumn arrived quietly in Connecticut, carrying cooler mornings and a softness in the air that hinted at change without demanding attention. Nearly a year had passed since that afternoon at the country club, and Margaret Whitmore felt the steady rhythm of her life settling into something unexpectedly expansive. The scholarship fund in Thomas Whitmore's name had already awarded its first recipient, a young nursing student who had written a handwritten letter expressing gratitude that felt sincere and unpolished. Margaret kept that letter on her desk, folded carefully beside her reading glasses. It reminded her that value, when directed intentionally, multiplied rather than diminished. Her relationship with Emily had not collapsed, but it had recalibrated. Invitations still arrived. Phone calls still came. Yet the tone had shifted. Requests were phrased with more caution. Assumptions were replaced with questions. In early May, as another Mother's Day approached, Emily suggested a smaller gathering at Margaret's home instead of an elaborate brunch elsewhere. There was hesitation in her voice, a quiet awareness that the previous year had altered something fundamental. Margaret agreed with composed warmth. On the morning of the gathering, she arranged fresh hydrangeas in a crystal vase and set the dining table with simple white linens. She did not attempt grandeur. She chose intention. When Emily arrived with the grandchildren, there was no velvet box, no dramatic presentation. Instead, Emily handed her mother a carefully wrapped package and said, without performance, that she appreciated everything her mother had done over the years, even the things that had gone unspoken. Margaret opened the gift slowly. Inside was a framed photograph of the two of them from decades earlier, taken at Emily's college graduation. On the back, Emily had written a note acknowledging the sacrifices that had made that moment possible. The room was quiet when Margaret finished reading. She did not look at Diane, who stood nearby with polite composure. She looked only at her daughter. There were no apologies exchanged directly, no dramatic reconciliations. Just recognition. Later that afternoon, after the guests had left and the house returned to stillness, Margaret walked into her study and opened the familiar drawer. The faded plastic bracelet remained where she had placed it months before. She picked it up, turning it once in her fingers, noticing how the silver letters had nearly worn away. It no longer carried weight. It had served its purpose. She placed it gently into a small keepsake box and closed the lid. Outside, the late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across her lawn. Margaret understood now that dignity was not defended through confrontation, but preserved through choice. She had chosen to redefine her worth without announcement, to adjust her generosity without bitterness, to allow consequences to unfold without spectacle. In doing so, she had shifted not only her financial plans but the tone of her relationships. Respect had not been demanded. It had been earned back through clarity. And as she stood at the window, watching the first leaves of the season begin to fall, Margaret felt something deeper than satisfaction. She felt alignment, the quiet assurance that her value no longer depended on applause at a decorated table, but rested firmly in the boundaries she had drawn with calm and unwavering grace.